Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. Welcome, David, John.
What's up? Good to see you guys.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, it looks like what have you all been up to lately? We always see each other in random spots, and so it's good to get the crew back together here. So what have you been up to, Dave?
A bunch of stuff, actually. Lots of life changes. So
Yeah.
prior to last week, I was traveling Airbnbs for, I guess, a year. And just in random places like Colorado, even the West Coast, we made it all the way out there. But we finally settled down, and now we're in a brownstone in Hoboken. So
Congrats.
Yep. Thank you.
That's cool. How about you, John?
Hey, Joe. Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me today. David, good to see you again. Yeah, I've been up to a lot of stuff. Had my first child and some big product launches, and running into you, Joe, and Matt, wherever we cross paths. Recently was in Verbier in Switzerland with you. So
yeah, we got dinner in Geneva too.
Stuff.
Yep.
Dinner in Geneva, good spot. Really good service. Really kind hostesses, as you remember.
Yeah, great place. Yeah, it's good to see you again.
Jealous, very jealous.
Yeah. Well, how about you, Matt? Have a good weekend?
Yeah, just kind of hanging out. I actually had to do some moving myself, so I understand the moving between Airbnb things. Just so, yeah, maybe not as well as David does, but yeah.
Well, we can only aspire to move between Airbnbs, but anyway, but let's talk about something that's much more riveting and exciting. Change data capture and streaming. I know. Calm down. But I consider you both to be some of the foremost experts in the field on this topic here. I think from both a business and a technical level, right? So yeah. So anyway, happy to have you both here to talk. Let's get into it. What is the state of streaming and change data capture in kind of mid 2024?
A pretty broad topic. I'm happy to chime in a little bit.
Take a stab at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually John had a post recently where he was talking about this particular chat and how he's excited. He called it the golden age of change data capture. And I think that was a pretty apt way of putting it, right? Like just a really, really high level. We're in a world now where everyone's always run businesses off of operational databases. And it might have been kind of either hard or useless to get that data out previously, right? Useless, I say, because where would you actually analyze it, right? That's a lot of data that you have that are coming from transactions out of databases, and actually analyzing that write-ahead log could be really complex and expensive, and hard because a big business, you're talking about terabytes of data. So I think we're in a place where finally the technology exists and makes it simple and affordable enough to actually extract data on an ongoing basis and use it for analytics or operational use cases, and kind of it's open to the masses now.
Yeah, 100%, David. That's a great call out. I said it's the golden age of change data capture because there's so much great technology out there, so much great choice for people who are out there and need to build these pipelines. And I think people are becoming more mature in the way that they're doing this. And when I say people, I mean the sort of the modern data stack engineer. That's we're sort of beating a dead horse when we talk about the modern data stack being dead. But when you think about the modern data stack, right, it's like ELT style batch data integration where you click a bunch of buttons, connect your Salesforce to like your data warehouse, like a Snowflake or a BigQuery. People say, oh, well, that batch ELT tool has a database connector. Let me just plug that in too. Well, then suddenly you're running into all these technical issues around consistency, correctness, recoverability, things that would really only appear when people are like, hey, I'm looking at this report and this financial statement report we have looks wrong, or this invoice number doesn't look right. How do we calculate this? And it turns out, if you have batches and you have duplicates and all these things from CDC, it kind of messes it up. So now you have tools that are easy to use, that use CDC and streaming. So you get that correctness, you get that low latency, and I think the traditional modern data stack engineer, now we're calling them traditional, even though it's modern and innovative, but they're becoming more sophisticated in dealing with CDC streams. So yeah, it's a great time to be doing it. Plus you have a lot of cool open source tools around it too.
Yeah. To me, I mean, like CDC has been around for a long time. I don't know exactly when it was first done. Probably goes back to the 60s, like so many things in data. But my impression is that the big change is that up into probably the 2000s, CDC was mostly just used to synchronize databases. You synchronize from an operational store to a data warehouse store, and now it's possible to actually process the stream, like you were saying, John. No pun intended there. David, what are you seeing in terms of like customer use patterns? Are you seeing a big change in practice and people processing the stream in more real time as opposed to just synchronizing?
Yeah, definitely. So it really depends on use cases, right? You have a lot of use cases where customers just want to do some basic analytics and they actually don't really care about latency, and they want to get the data from A to B. So, for those, it's a pretty standard practice, and it's usually stand up a warehouse, stand up some sort of CDC. Estuary is, the one that we see, and kind of just sync the two. I think the more interesting thing comes along when the customer actually has like a truly real-time use case, where seconds matter, right? Like when we're not talking anymore about a minute being good enough, or 5 minutes being good enough, and then there's still a little bit more complexity to get these types of use cases to be working, but there's a lot of good options and tools for stuff like that now as well. Even if you're doing like materialized views and computing a real-time materialized view in those cases. So, we see a little bit more of that. A lot of customers come in thinking they know the technology stack that they're going to use, and kind of proving themselves that maybe that's not the right one if you have super low latency use cases, and kind of pivoting a little bit and kind of setting into potentially some more real true stream oriented systems for those transformations. So that's high level of what we see.
Are you saying the same thing, John? I mean, it feels like, well, let me caveat this with saying it feels like real time is definitely one of these things where it could mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But are you seeing something similar to what David's mentioning?
Yeah. There's the real time aspect of it, which is not always required for analytics teams. So that's when it is required, it's not something that's just going to work out of the box with a batch tool, of course. So this is why we introduce architectures like streaming and Kappa architectures, where you kind of combine the streaming pipeline to the batch pipeline. And it's good to think about that as like a kind of a category of use cases around CDC and streaming. And then it's also, how do we reliably reconstruct the database in OLAP systems like a Snowflake or a BigQuery or a Redshift? And CDC and streaming is still the best way to do it. I mean, you could pull your database every 30 minutes and, take snapshots and things like that. If your database organization is sophisticated enough, a DBA will pretty much set your hair on fire and say, don't do that, or you're going to crash the operational database. Right. So, it's sort of these pseudo technical use cases, but when you look at the business use cases, that's where real time and CDC streaming becomes particularly interesting. And, we're seeing some really cool use cases pop up there.
It's really interesting. What are some of these use cases? I'm always curious, like what kind of takes up the bulk of these like super low latency? Like David, you said, seconds or under seconds that matter. Like what are these types of workloads that you're seeing?
So usually something like a logistics use case where there's a person in the loop, right? Like a lot of the common thread here is there's a human in the loop, and you actually, the human doesn't want to wait for a report to update so that they know like where the location of a package is, or, something like that. So that's a pretty common one. Finance is another example, telco, we see a decent amount of that where, you know, for various reasons that are really good or not, those types of companies do want low latency updates. And sometimes they're totally warranted, sometimes they're not. But a lot of the times, those industries, I think, are pretty common ones that we see in marketing too. You know, there's some use cases there. I'm curious what John has to say there.
Yeah, 100%. You know, logistics, supply chain, finance. You know, I'll call out some amazing operators in the data space who are doing just the coolest stuff with CDC and streaming. There's Ganesh Devarayan and his team, Pradeep with two over at American Airlines, and how they're powering their maintenance operations. You know, collecting all the telemetry from aircrafts and the supply chain around parts and inventory, and basically turning that into that you know, a global operation where, you know, those people at airports with the yellow vest run around, you know, making sure the aircraft is good to take off. And, you know, that's not something where they can just, you know, wait around for 30 minutes for some batch job to complete to see if, you know, the aircraft is good to go, right? They, you know, every second on the ground is critical to them, and, you know, providing a great customer service. So, you know, that's where CDC and streaming is a real enabler of business success for them. The other person I want to call out is Pinaki Mitra over at UPS Capital. And they basically use CDC and streaming to calculate confidence scores in packages that UPS is shipping. And they also offer it as a service to their partners that use UPS for shipping and logistics. And this is actually an AI-driven use case, revenue-generating AI-driven product. But at the, you know, at the top of the pipeline, at the kind of where the data is nascent, yeah, CDC and streaming is critical there, because to generate reliable confidence scores, you need reliable data, and you need it to come, you know, in near real time. You know, of course, making sure the data is correct and reliable is the most critical thing, and then the timeliness and the freshness of the data goes hand in hand with that. So, you know, my advice to data teams that are looking at their use cases, you know, don't just say, hey, we don't have real time, we don't need streaming. You also need to think about, you know, how you're actually materializing the data in your OLAP system, your analytical models, and really, you know, dive into that part as well.
I think broadly, one of the things Joe and I are interested in is this barrier that has always existed between the operational side of software and the analytics side of the world. And I think part of what I'd like to see is CDC and other approaches with streaming to kind of break down some of those barriers. Is it premature for that to happen, or is that something we're seeing right now? We've certainly discussed it with some of our clients that, like, maybe they need to re-architect in a more streaming native way, not just for analytics, but on the application side of the house as well. I'll start with you, David. Are we getting ahead of ourselves, or is this something you're seeing in practice, boots on the ground?
No, 100%. I think we're seeing it in practice. You have a lot of tools that make it possible to kind of intermix the two. I'll give just one example. Like Snowflake Dynamic Tables is a good example of a way that you can kind of take data that's stream oriented in nature and be able to compute views of it, and, you know, have them always up to date, I'll call it, but like relatively up to date within your warehouse. So, and of course, Databricks has their own version of this as well, and, you know, everyone's kind of going that direction. So it's getting to be a world where, like, these things, these ways of viewing the world are totally intermixed, right? Like, and it's kind of being stream oriented in nature gives you ultimate flexibility, right? You can go either direction that way, as opposed to if you're batch oriented in nature, then you are going that direction, and it would require a fundamental change in tooling to change the other way.
John?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, David. And, you know, teams that already have the warehouse, you'll see that your warehouse, if you're using one of the cloud ones like BigQuery, Snowflake, Redshift, even, you know, Microsoft Fabric, you know, streams are becoming a native concept there. And, you know, even BigQuery announced continuous queries, you know, to process data as soon as it's ingested into BigQuery. And, you know, they have streaming endpoints, like Snowflake has Snowpipe streaming, which is super performant. So it's not like, hey, you know, I have to really shake things up in my data org to get CDC and streaming to a point where it's sophisticated. It's just kind of an incremental at this stage. So, your same data teams that are familiar with Snowflake and SQL and analytical modeling that you typically do in the warehouse, they can adopt streaming now. It's easier than ever. So, I think that's one of the other developments that's really exciting in the last, 2-3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing to just add in there is I think even the other direction is kind of happening a little bit. Just for instance, we are a streaming tool, but we do include upserts into the warehouse. So you can, have batch upserts from a streaming tool and kind of like go that direction.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So what are your thoughts on this where you could use the database as a persistence layer, so your production database, and then do, say, change data capture off of that database versus, I guess, just doing events within the code itself and just firing events, say, within my application? What are your thoughts on the pros and cons of that approach?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Sure. I think one of the advantages of doing events from that are fired directly is that they're usually really well thought out, right? So when you create those, a lot of the times you're going to ensure that you have a schema and you have an API service and you have something like that that's all set up and ready to go. And one of the potential gotchas for just doing CDC and then setting services up from a change data capture endpoint is maybe it's a different team that controls that. And if so, you're not really guaranteed that that data is going to stay the same shape. So you better have a good way of making sure that those changes are, when the schema changes upstream, reflect downstream and they don't kind of break your production services that are reliant on it. So that's definitely something that I see.
What about you, John?
Yeah, my first stream processing implementation was basically a concurrent queue that, I was doing research when I was a CS computer science student for my department chair. And, when you actually look at the end-to-end, products that you receive as a data engineer that do data streaming, it's either a concurrent queue implementation, deep under the hood, or essentially a write-ahead log-based implementation, like essentially Kafka, right? So you get a lot of advantages by operationalizing this, by letting the operational database be the source of truth, because the transaction log gives you enough data to reconstruct the state of the database, right? So that's the most reliable way to do it. But it really depends on what your upstream sources are. And, like David called out, schema changes and things along those lines. How do schema changes actually propagate downstream? Chad Sanderson and Mark Freeman are doing a lot of good work in that area. They're coming out with an awesome book on this topic that really gets into the weeds here. And it is really something that data teams need to go head on and adopt, especially when you have like these revenue generating AI products or something that's really critical in the business. You can't sort of punt on these problems, right?
Yeah. Especially if it's revenue generating, that would be bad. So, You're kind of alluding to something earlier, and you mentioned earlier Kappa architecture. So this is something that Jay Krebs, I think, he published a paper. Maybe about 2014, I think it was, or some year like that, early on. And then it sort of fizzled out, it felt like. But do you see Kappa maybe coming back? And maybe explain Kappa for the audience too, just in case you didn't get the memo 10 years ago about the paper. So
yeah, Kappa is the counter to the Lambda architecture. So I'm defining Kappa by first defining Lambda. So Lambda is like, hey, you have like these separate pipelines for batch and streaming. Kappa is basically saying, no, we're going to combine these pipelines. You're going to do streaming for data ingest and upstream processing and capture and recovery and all that good stuff that streaming is really good at. And then you're going to feed that data into batch systems like your data warehouse or maybe a data lake that you're running Spark jobs on top of. and that's like your long-term storage tier, and where you're also serving the data from, because that's what batch is best at, right? Kind of like these infrequent jobs that are just processing data and serving it to some other consumers and outputting it, right? We go back to even like map reduce jobs and things like that. So yes, it I think maybe from a hype perspective, it might have fizzled out. I know Jay Krebs from Confluent certainly put some good blogs together on that topic. But I do see it getting just a ton of adoption in the enterprises. Maybe teams don't even know that they're doing it, but if you're using like a streaming tool like Kafka and you're writing that data into an open table format like Iceberg or Delta, you're actually already doing Kappa architecture.
I couldn't agree more. Basically. That's exactly how I define it. One of the biggest fundamental limitations of Kafka is that Kafka, for the most part, has been limited to storage that's in brokers, right? Which really greatly limits the amount of storage that you can do. And that's not the same as a batch system, right? Batch systems, you create a big data lake. Maybe you can extract the data, and maybe you can figure out what you've extracted and how to extract it, or maybe it's just a swamp. But you fundamentally have the ability to do that. And that's pretty hard in a streaming system. So that's still a bit of a limitation. There's, a few technologies that address that, but it definitely is something that I think inspired the reason to have like a Kappa or a Lambda architecture at the beginning back 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big changes we've seen is that these architectures are alive and well, but they're kind of hidden from users more and more. And so in our book, even we talk about the notion of the managed Lambda architecture. And John, you mentioned BigQuery, and BigQuery does something like this, right? So if you use BigQuery streaming, it maintains multiple pipelines. It has the batch side of the house and it has the streaming side, but you as a user never see that. And that takes away the whole nightmare of managing two systems in Lambda, like someone else is doing the work for you. I mean, maybe you both can comment on similar things with Kappa and Lambda. Are we getting to the point where users just don't have to worry about these behind the scenes details, or are there still cases where you really need to fight that battle and build your own custom systems with two pipelines?
Or should you bring it back and just everyone should build their custom system?
On Hadoop, ideally. Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely Hadoop. Let's bring Hadoop back. Yeah, it was so successful the first time around.
Bring up that comment, Joe, from Carl.
Oh, which one? Carl. Oh, Kappa and Lambda discussions give many people Hadoop PTSD from years ago. And I give a quick shout out to use Joe 20 for 20% off your first month of BetterHelp. So if this
What's BetterHelp? Is that can we plug it? What is it? Or is it a joke?
It's a joke. It's a online therapy thing. So
for recovering Hadoop users.
Yeah, this is specifically geared towards recovering Hadoop users, actually. So such a huge group of people that are really need help out there. But yeah, I mean, what do you think about Matt's question though? If you remember it.
Yeah, I do. Matt, your question was about, hey, do data teams actually need to worry about this stuff, or is it just going to be abstracted from us? I think it's always important for data engineers to understand the underlying architectures as much as possible. There's no tool that's going to come in and just be like a complete black box layer of indirection from complexity. You sort of have to bathe in the complexity to really understand it and deploy a resilient system that works well. Because I mean, what if there was like your hair on fire type of production outage, and someone comes to you and says like, hey, how do we debug this? And you're like, I don't know, like this tool's a black box. It just does it for us. Like, that's not a good answer, right? Even if you do have like a bunch of vendors in-house, right? You ultimately want to know how that works. But I think the implementation path is simpler than ever. Definitely less tools, definitely less internal kind of skunkworks code that your team has to maintain. So I think that's the positive. So when you actually look at it from like a ROI calculation, like, how much time is your engineering team investing or your data team investing into maintaining the system versus the output you're getting from it. And, whether it's revenue or internal executives who have, these very critical dashboards, it's definitely trending positive for data streaming.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there's a lot of the things that can be abstracted away, and they work really well while you're using them under the garden path route. But then, of course, once you get to a non-standard route, or an issue, a production issue happens, how do you recover? How do you backfill? How do you do something like that? There's a lot of potential ways around that, and some of the tooling, like John mentioned, BigQuery, they have a great solution for this. Not every warehouse is going to have just as good of a solution for that. So it's good to understand the technology that you're using, and just to understand how it works under the hood, so that you can make sure you're working around it. There's some non-Kafka type technologies out there that are kind of making streaming storage easier. There's a company called Striim that's trying to do that. We have an open source thing called Gazette that
Gazette's dope.
We built it. Yeah, so we built the company based on that, and it allows you to do native cloud storage for streaming data. And so there's a lot of innovation. And, even Confluent, Kafka has a cloud storage offload. And so just understanding the tools that you have and all the options that come with the tool, I think, are the key for running a business off of it, especially when it's a big business where you're doing things yourself.
Yeah, and I completely agree with what you said as well, John, that understanding the stuff happening behind the scenes is really, really critical for data engineers. It's funny, like maybe you've seen this as well, but Joe and I see over and over again that a lot of fundamental data problems in new generation like data warehouses just come down to not understanding how columnar databases work, like again and again and again. And I imagine you see similar things in the streaming world where people try to do things that just don't make sense with the underlying architecture, even though the abstraction is there to make your life easier.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask you guys this. So starting with Dave, like what are some anti-patterns that you see? I think kind of drawing off of what Matt's talking about, what are some of the anti-patterns that you see when it comes to change data capture or streaming?
A good question. I think maybe one of the biggest is that it goes back to tooling, right? Like if you are working with a change data capture and you've been sold on like very real-time updates, you try to plunge these very real-time updates into a data warehouse that's column stored, and it's maybe not built for those exact low latency updates. Usually you can get like minutes. So that's definitely something that we see often, and really just putting a lot of time and effort into that, where there's probably other architectures that might accomplish that a little bit better and more easily. But yeah, I think they do come into back to exactly what Matt was saying just now, which is understand the technology, understand how it actually works under the hood, and then use the right tool for the job. It's really hard to bring a knife to a gunfight.
And what are some anti-patterns you see, John?
Not talking to DBAs as much as analytics teams try to use the CDC tool as like a vessel to to work with the database by skirting the DBAs. Look, analytics teams need to be aware of the upstream producers as much as possible. Otherwise, you're going to have all these CDC changes coming from tables in a database that you're not going to be able to make sense of. Like, hey, like there's some view that I have in the database that has like some random pseudo-anonymization going on, and we don't know how it works. Or hey, we're adding too much overhead to the database. What the DBA should really be doing is setting up a downstream database to do mining off of. But you don't want to have that conversation because it's a tough conversation to have, because you're basically creating work for another team. But ultimately, you have to make that case because somewhere someone got the budget for BigQuery or Snowflake or analytics in general for your organization. It must be valuable, right? So getting that cross-department communication is critical to making sure A, you understand what the data represents, and B, that you're technically set up to do CDC the correct way, where you're getting real-time data, but you're also minimizing load on the operational database. And it really comes down to the people, not the pipeline. So getting that communication going, because so many times when we're going in and triaging change data capture pipelines here at Striim, it's like, hey, we got to bring the DBA into the room, because the analytics team alone doesn't have enough leverage to solve database replication problems, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to that end, there's cases that we see all the time that, you have this huge load in the middle of the night, and it turns out that the DBA team is dropping in and recreating, truncating a table and recreating it every single night. So, CDC doesn't actually help you very much in that case, right? CDC is meant for incremental changes to a data set that you can port over. We definitely see that where like this one table just is responsible for a huge amount of load and a huge amount of impact. And you kind of have to figure out what to do about it, because it's not, and no one actually knew that from the analytics side, how these data sets are loaded and anything like that.
Oh crap! I can only imagine what that looks like when you get that change data capture payload from the truncate reload table. Just like, it sounds like a nightmare. Speaking of that too, like, what do you recommend for companies in terms of column level changes? Like, should they look at every table in the database and every column within each table, or what do you recommend for tracking changes?
I mean, having the full image is, having the full image is always preferred, but there are going to be situations where you are constrained to the database application and you have partial column logging. Either work in theory, so I don't think that obviously having the full image is the easiest to reconstruct state downstream, but it's not impossible to do so from partial column logging either.
Yeah, it's a bit of a business decision at the end of the day, because tooling allows for both at this point. So, the business, there's very valid reasons to have partial column logging, like for instance, not wanting PII to ever leave your org if you're working with a vendor or doing anything like that. That's a great reason to use partial column logging, and it shouldn't theoretically mess anything up from a technical perspective. So my view is that it's a business related thing more than anything.
Yeah, makes sense. So Matt, you look like you want to say something.
Oh, I was just going to ask. I mean, we're kind of getting to problems here that are as old as technology, which is a lot of these problems we run into, regardless of how good the technology is, just come down to facilitating team communication and common incentives. I know you're both on the vendor side, but like, I'm curious if you have other thoughts on that, like how you actually make that happen and what you've seen in working with customers. I'll start with you, John.
Yeah, definitely. It's part of our process here to make sure that there's really good communication from all the technical stakeholders. And even when you have the database managed by a third party, like an SI or some software that that's not really in the organization's control, you got to get as much alignment as possible and make sure that CDC is something that the organization is staffed for, because there's a business use case and budget behind it. So definitely having that line of communication is important, because database CDC is not as easy as doing SAS ELT, right? It's not like, hey, I'm just pulling some API. Not that SAS ELT is super easy, but it is at least like a service that like Salesforce, or I'm calling out a bunch of SaaS vendors like HubSpot, right? They provide an API as a service, and you just pull it and you get the objects, right? Database CDC is kind of this looser area of abstraction, where either you're reverse engineering the write ahead log, or you're working with some write ahead log oriented API. So that thing is being generated by software that's usually custom software written by the enterprise. So the way that database behaves is very custom. So when you have any situation with customization like that, yeah, you need the people who are defining that customization, in the room with you, so you know how to properly mine changes from any streams that it's generating.
Yeah, I think that's, for the most part, it's right. I would suggest that probably SaaS APIs are less defined than one would think and hope that they actually are. But yeah, CDC, one of the funniest things I think we see is that a lot of the times the first conversation that the analytics side and the DBA side of the house will ever have is when we get them in a room to talk to each other. And that's like a legitimate thing. Like, I remember the first company that we ever did CDC with, they were like, oh wow, that's what our data looks like, when they saw it. And that's it's probably an extreme example, but it's certainly the actual way that a lot of these things work. The analytics side really sometimes doesn't have access to the data. They don't see how it's changing. There's a lot of coordination to do, and that coordination by itself is something that I think we all underestimate. It tends to be like, there's a really good reason that the concept of data contracts resonated so much with everyone, and it's because things change, and it's something that isn't communicated down to the analytics side necessarily, and everyone feels the pain constantly of like updating DBT models and however you address that.
I'm curious. One of the things that's really notorious for people on the analytics side of data engineering is ORM. And so ORM, basically you take an object model written in something like Java and automatically you get a generated schema, generated tables. And the problem with that is that the data model in the output might not be very pretty. Like it might look really nice as an object inside Java or C++ or whatever. And on the other side, it can look absolutely awful. What are you seeing in terms of the state of ORM? Is this practice growing, shrinking, and what kind of pain does it cause you on the streaming side? I know Joe and I are familiar with the pain of working on the batch side of the house with ORM sometimes.
Yeah, back to my days writing Hibernate code and Java and stuff like that. Or like Nucleus, whatever your tool is, and if there's XML wrappers, yeah, it can be painful to work with ORM. But it's also the layer of indirection is still the database, which is nice. So it gives this internal software development teams that are generating rows in the database, sort of just like a nice object-oriented way of, making those changes to the database, or, the DMLs and the DDLs, which is good. And then the data teams can basically pick that up as from the write-ahead log using the database as the abstraction layer. So I don't see that pattern going away anytime soon. I'm sure there's, there's new things coming out like ADBC. I think it's what it's called. Just like another like more broader connectivity layer to databases that will probably bring in its own layer of innovation. So on top of what JDBC has already done, just making it more broad across languages. So like things like Rust and Go can also leverage this pattern.
I think that probably John and I don't experience that pain particularly as much as end practitioners experience the pain. We just build software that faithfully mirrors data in whatever format the database says it comes in into the destination, and we get to wipe our hands clean at that point and say, yeah, it wasn't our fault that it came like that. That's what your data model says. Take it up with someone else. So I think from our standpoint, it's not as painful as it could be, but I assume that we are missing some of that, and the actual people that are working with the data are dealing with it more than us.
What are your thoughts, Matt?
I think ORM is nice in principle. I kind of go back to what David was saying earlier. In many cases, when you connect these teams for streaming, it might be the first time they're actually talking, where the software developers and DBAs on one side and then the analytics people on the other side are chatting with each other. And I would just love to see more of that in general as software is written, so that as you're developing the data model, whether it's with ORM or just more manually, traditionally, there's this conversation about like, hey, what do we care about for analytics? And by the way, how might we use analytics directly in the user interface of our application? And how should we think about the model to support these different use cases? It seems like that would save a lot of pain in general. What are your thoughts, Joe? Obviously, you care a lot about data modeling right now and in general. So what are your thoughts on ORM and how it affects data modeling?
I mean, I don't really have an opinion on ORM, whether it's good or bad, because it's so pervasive that for me to have an opinion, sort of like having an opinion of, I don't know, air. It's like not much I can do about it, even if I wanted to. So, and I really hate air. I'm just kidding. But it's an interesting one. The comment about this is what our data looks like. Actually, I can understand why that comment would be made. If you're a software developer and you're just used to writing class objects, for example, right, and dealing with the ORM at that interface, right, then that's you may not know what the data looks like. I know quite a few software devs that probably haven't actually looked at the data in their database. That's sort of not your job in some ways, and sort of is, but you can sort of punt on it too. And so I think that's I think a valid reason for it. And the interesting thing is when you're trying to write objects also capture behavior, which the relational model can't capture, right? So that's one of the object relational impedances, and the mismatch of that is sort of where you get off, but and they kind of get off kilter at least. But I don't know. It's one of those things where I feel like it's just such a they're so pervasive at this point that, I mean, how many ORMs for every man, woman, and child are there on this earth? I mean, they're everywhere. So, but the modeling, I can definitely see why that would be a problem. But as Dave points out, though, I think at the end of the day, whatever data is in your database happens to be the data that's there, and that's kind of it. So what are you going to do about it? You know? So it's yeah. And Roy Hassan actually, hey, what's up, Roy? He's got a good point here. CDC was not designed to map between operational and analytical. It was designed to replicate state between databases. So we're building solutions on top of each tech CDC that was designed for what we're trying to do. So of course there's some mismatching, and we need to focus on solving this problem in a new way. What do you think of Roy's comment? Roy's obviously got a lot of experience and insight in this field.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not like, hey, click a few buttons and now we're suddenly able to analyze all our database data in the warehouse. It's definitely requires someone to do some brainstorming and thinking how to best, represent the data in an analytical format that solves the analytics use cases or whatever downstream, operational use cases that you're building on top of, the warehouse or the data lake. So yeah, there's definitely a design element to it that requires someone to do some creative and critical thinking there. So yeah, Roy, that's a great point. CDC is basically just a mechanism to take those changes, and now you sort of have these raw changes. You can either, right, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can either just mirror the exact database tables in your warehouse, or you can kind of replicate the write ahead log and reconstruct just the business views that you need. Some companies do things like outbox pattern, which is like, hey, we're going to tell the DBAs exactly what we need in the warehouse, and they're going to maintain these outbox tables. I think that's actually kind of a more of a controversial way of going about it. I think if you brought up outbox pattern to some DBA types with really large database deployments, you might get some pushback, but ultimately that's just pointing out that there's so much options and flexibility and ways you can design this. And yeah, CDC is just a way of replicating those changes. So yeah, great point, Roy.
So apologies if there's any noise in the background for me. There's a TV being delivered here. So
that's fine.
That's just the way that these things work, right? But
the way it is.
Yeah, I agree with John. We're kind of talking about not really a technology problem, right? CDC is designed to do something, and it does that pretty well, right? You're able to extract events and make sure that you always have an exact copy of your source and your destination using it. But if that's not what you want, then that's a person problem, right? You need to design it differently and make sure that you put in place an agreement between the producers of data and the people who are actually using it downstream to ensure that the schema is as you want, to ensure that it's in the proper format. And that's something that can be done. A lot of, up until very recently, that's exactly how it was done. You'd have software engineers building the data products and creating maybe events that fired off that whenever it happens. So it's something that you can do through tables, through events, through a lot of different things, but just taking that data, never having a conversation and mirroring it downstream isn't going to solve it. That's, the pretty simple truth.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it feels like CDC is a good bridge to event-based thinking. Like if you come from the software world and you're used to building, fairly straightforward web stack, in the world you come from, you always use a database, you capture state that way. You start doing CDC, now you've turned that state into events. But the problem is there's a risk that we get stuck on the bridge and that we can't get to the other side, even though there's a lot of opportunity on the other side. Like Joe was saying, like you said, Joe, earlier, where why not just directly generate the event rather than hitting the database if it really makes sense just to work in terms of events?
Well, yeah, and I was just noodling on what Roy was saying, and it seems like that's one possible future is, I mean, if you kind of look at the history of data models, for example, and kind of how we got to today, right? You're trying to map, or say, a relational model. That's back then. That's kind of where CDC, at least those types of databases, where they got their start. To something that's more analytically appropriate. But part of me wonders if we've been doing this wrong the entire time. Maybe it is a completely event-based system where I don't know what those objects look like, right? Objects being the events. So lots of noodling, probably lots of ayahuasca ceremonies trying to figure this out or something. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, but the thing is, CDC's it's the best of the worst. I mean, what's your option, right? If you're not going to use it, are you just going to do incremental batch replication like we did? And then you get to deal with Dave was talking about where, you have your DBA team truncate and reload to the table every night. So you don't even know what state updates or changes were applied to the table. I mean, that's a state of analytics for quite a while, right? I mean, if you try doing data, just doing straight polls from your operational database, that's from an analytics standpoint, that's hell on earth. You have no idea what changed. Even if you're doing it on 24-hour sync or even an hourly sync, like what about everything that happened in between? So
the funniest story of that I had seen was a company that wasn't just doing inserts. They were doing a truncation, and then they'd do inserts and then updates afterwards. And they'd put like 30 million events into this thing, and only 3 of them would be across unique primary keys.
What?
So you'd every single night you're recomputing the world at like 10x over.
My brain just melted.
Mine did too, figuring that out. They were like, what's going on here?
Was there a reason for that though? I mean,
did it.
Okay. Oh. What do you mean by that? It was us that did it.
We had to figure out what was going on, right?
Okay. That's interesting.
And look, sometimes doing CDC and adding a new set of consumers can be a health check for your organization to see, if you have a bunch of technical debt and bad practices on your database, and you're telling your analytics teams to just deal with it, and the result of that is it's going to obviously fail at some point. But now your company can say, okay, well, if we have this technical debt on the database layer, this is a good chance to resolve it, right? Because we're budgeting for analytics. We're trying to get into AI. Our CEO wants, real-time reports and AI and all this great stuff, right? So it's also in the process, go in and resolve some of the technical debt. Let's say, our database has like long-running open transactions that, last for like 2 weeks at a time. That's a horrible database engineering practice. This is your opportunity to resolve it because it's already being budgeted, to support the business use case of analytics or AI, or things like, hey, we're truncating and reloading, a massive, 1 terabyte, table every single night and creating all this load on the database and all this pain for downstream consumers. I think, analytics and streaming and CDC is a great opportunity to actually resolve some of that technical debt, get it budgeted, get some, because how does anything get resolved in a large engineering organization? Someone has to feel pain, right? And then for that pain, there has to be some revenue or operational impact to it. And that's the only time we actually see, teams kind of, rally the support to get it fixed.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example. The 2-week transaction, definitely something that we should have brought up in that section.
Yeah. It's so funny because we've seen this play out where it's like, hey, analytics team says, oh my gosh, we have like this long running transaction that's slowing down our pipelines. Every time we recover, we have to go back 2 weeks in time. And the DBA say that's just how it is. But if you escalate that high up enough, someone at the C level is gonna be like, why do we have these long running transactions, right? We should fix that. So but otherwise, it's like if no one feels the pain, that technical debt's just going to stay there. right? I mean, and there's tons of examples of that. If you're in engineering, like something that like a software engineer will call an anti-pattern or inefficient, but there's just no kind of like budget or executive pain to go fix it, so it's just there. So yeah, it's the fun journey of production software development.
Oh yeah. What's that?
I'd love to see something like that get prioritized in a sprint planning meeting, right? Like reworking this query to be to be a faster transaction. Just not something that comes up.
Yeah. I guess closing out, we got about a few minutes left. We're talking about the state of streaming and CDC today. Where do you think it's all going? If you were to sort of play Nostradamus and zoom out over the next 5 years, what do you think happens?
I think there will be more revenue generating AI driven products. There's a lot of hype around AI, but there's also a lot of value already being delivered. It's sort of a no-brainer if you already have the warehouse and the data sophistication. I call out the great work that Pinaki Mitra and his team at UPS did. Even at their size and scale to bring a new AI driven product to market, just using CDC streaming with like Striim and BigQuery as their warehouse and Vertex as the AI layer. And it's actually, they actually have customers using this service now. It's really like generating value to the business. So I think you're going to see a lot of organizations that are building up the sophistication right now get to the same point eventually. Because like me and David talked about here, there's a lot of anti-patterns out there. There was too many people doing like batch for their CDC and things like that. They're going to mature at some point, and once they do, then they're going to be able to get this additional business value of launching like revenue generating or super efficiency driving operational use cases with CDC and streaming. That's so my Nostradamus thing is there's going to be a lot of value to come out of it for sure.
I think so.
Yeah, I think we're already seeing a ton of changes in this space. Just the ease with which you can get started with CDC means that everyone is kind of taking it up now. It's kind of impressive how many businesses you can talk to, and they're thinking about it and getting started. So that's helping. I totally agree that like lower latency data is something that's going to power AI initiatives. And that's both in CDC, but also maybe coming out of some SaaS APIs, so that you can, make sure to have a fresh view within any AI model that is being generated. So those things I think are probably what's powering this huge initiative to kind of really get started on CDC for a lot of businesses.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, Matt and I have always speculated this, but we feel like the next shoe to drop is really streaming and change data capture and such become so easy to use. It basically has the same impact that the quote modern data stack had in terms of just making data tools available to everybody at the, basically within minutes instead of longer than minutes, the reverse of real time. So I mean, if you imagine how painful it was back in the day, even 5 years ago to spin up anything that was quote streaming or CDC, the technologies weren't there yet. The platforms weren't there yet. It was just, but it was what it was. You dealt with what I mean, I think that's one of the reasons, a lot of batch-oriented things took off, right? DBT got super popular because it made analytics a lot easier to do on batch data, but I'll be interested to see what happens with streaming next and so forth, right? Because I think it's the old trope. If I can get it now, then why do I want to wait, right? It doesn't make any sense. So, but I think this, but what we're seeing now, what you guys are definitely both working on, and thank you for this, is that, and companies like Roy works at Upsolver, everyone's making it a lot easier to work with streaming data. That's just that's a good world to be in. So.
Yeah, and again, go ahead, John.
I was just gonna say, David and I wouldn't be doing it if there wasn't a ton of demand and pain in the organizations that need it. But Matt, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say, going back to what you said, Joe, is that I think in the end, the rise of accessible streaming, let's call it accessible streaming, streaming's been here for a while. The rise of accessible streaming is going to be much broader than the modern data stack just because you're now crossing over with analytics and application development. It's not just one side of the house. Really, there is the potential to merge these outlooks and get teams working together much more closely and start thinking about analytics as you're developing your application from the
Well,
beginning.
yeah. And I mean, this is what I was alluding to back in the discussion that Roy had prompted earlier, where I feel like this is going to be somewhat of a forcing function to help us kind of rethink this. I think this divide between operational and analytical. I mean, it's been sort of this holy grail, and and even people like Shamak Dagani have been talking about this with data mesh. I mean, that's ultimately the end game of it, right? It's just data products. That's all it is. This divide between software and data sort of disappears. I think streaming is how you're going to get there, though. Batch doesn't, because you don't have the feedback loop, right? Inherently, the way we've been doing it now, it means you're just lobbing things over the wall. That world needs to go away, in my opinion. So what do you say, Dave?
Yeah. No, I agree. I think the interesting thing is that we have two different groups of technical skills and personas that are kind of solving the same problem in just slightly different ways right now. And that feels like something that has to go away over the long term. It's a huge duplication of effort where sometimes we're even building the same data products on two sides of the fence.
A lot.
When I say sometimes, I mean every single organization that I've probably ever talked to.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's a crazy world, right? So, yeah. What do you? Any closing thoughts there, John?
Yeah, I think that currently the people that we see doing data streaming in CDC are like on two ends of the spectrum. One being, super sophisticated enterprise operator who has so much skin in the game, that they know that they need CDC and they're sophisticated that they know how to roll it out. The other end of the spectrum is really technical engineering and analytics teams at tech startups that are really like, they're not afraid of complexity. They'll just take it on because they know it's a big problem they need to solve. I think what we're all alluding to is now like sort of the mass market, data team, the type that, was using DBT and Snowflake and stuff like that because it was accessible and you could do it with a small team, can now take on data streaming. So I think that's going to be really exciting. And, we've called it democratizing streaming and things like that. And, David and his team are doing great work there. And, Striim on our side, we're investing in this too. And, that just means that there's just going to be a lot of great choice and flexibility and options for these teams.
For sure. Well, good chat. I'll let you guys give a quick plug for your respective companies. We normally don't do this for people, but I think that you guys are working on some cool stuff. So, Dave, what are you working on, and how can people find out more about that?
Sure. So I'm a co-founder of a company called Estuary. We make working with real-time data very easy to capture it via CDC and also some change data from SaaS sources as well, transform it and put it into destinations in real time. And you can learn more by coming to estuary.dev. Our goal is just to make it as easy as Batch, like exactly what we talked about here.
Dope. Thank you. Estuary's dope. And Striim, John.
Yes, I'm head of products here at Striim, was one of the early engineers before moving into products. But you can check us out at striim.com. We combine, our founding team came from Golden Gate, which is a large database replication product acquired by Oracle, but really solving the last generation of CDC problems. Now we're really looking to the future, like AI and real-time analytics in the warehouse. And kind of reimagine CDC for that. And the two I's in Striim, fun fact, stand for intelligent integration. And, this is what we really see as intelligent integration. It's having the CDC and streaming and analytics as like a combined unified layer.
Yep, that's dope. Yeah, like I said, both on the show, I think it's just good to get perspectives, I think. And you guys are two of the people I respect a ton, especially in the change data capture space and streaming. Just I think very well thought out opinions, but they're built on experience and probably a lot of war stories and hard knocks, like the gnarly thing you mentioned, Dave. I mean, that's a good example. And John, you got a ton too. So it's like, yeah, it's just we love talking about this kind of stuff with people who are actually out there doing it and building. I think building the future too. That's the other thing. It's I feel like we're definitely at this inflection point where as we kind of started off the modern data stack, it did its thing, and it did it. I think it succeeded at what it did. Analytics is cool again. It wasn't actually for a bit, 'cause data science was the cool thing, but analytics is cool. But we're on to the next thing, So that's I think it's where we gotta focus. So thank you all. Matt, I guess next week we have Yali Sassoon from Snowplow on. We'll be talking about whatever Yali wants to talk about. So,
but it will probably be related, right, to thinking in event-driven terms. I mean, very much what Snowplow does. So,
yeah, exactly. So, should be good. And then let me see here. I'm off to Chicago. Actually, I have to go catch an Uber in just a second here. And then next week, or actually, Matt and I are going to be at Jay on the Beach in Malaga, Spain. We're giving a workshop on May 8th on the fundamentals of data engineering. So if you're around in Malaga for any reason at all, I don't know why you would be there, but if you are, come to our workshop. It'll just make your life amazing. So
I don't know how much of that is us and how much of that is the beach, but just come.
The combination of the two, you really won't be able to beat it at all. So yeah, cool. You guys got any events coming up, by the way, Dave or John, before we cut out? Are you guys going to be anywhere or anything you want to announce?
Yeah, Snowflake Summits are our next big event. Gartner in London is our next big event. May 13th to May 15th, which should be fun. Might overlap. Maybe I can get a quick weekend trip to Malaga. Now that there's some good justification, you and Matt are there, Joe. So and then Snowflake Summit in June, and lots of fun What's New in Data podcast episodes coming out. David, you got to hop on too.
That would be super fun.
Yeah, you guys would be good together.
We have Snowflake Summit too, but I'm really feeling like we're missing the exotic destinations right now, and I'm gonna have to start thinking a little bit harder about Malaga, Spain, and what were you mentioning before, the skiers and data thing, and Geneva.
Skiers and data. That's a good one.
Yeah.
I hear it's going to be in a different place next year, but it's a good
City?
spot. I really wish. I keep telling Chris Tab, it's like Utah is made for events like this. Like literally made for events like this. We have 15 minutes from my house. I can get to about 7 ski resorts. Whatever, doesn't matter.
That's great. And the snow.
And snow.
You sold me. I mean,
yeah. Anyway, and then I'll be at a generative AI summit in London next month as well. I forgot about that. So anyway, then Snowflake Summit. I think I might be making an appearance there, and then got some stuff around Databricks as well. So anyway, Roy says skiers and speedos. That's that's the next event. So anyway, maybe Matt and I'll pioneer that at Malaga. I don't know.
Speak for yourself.
Okay, I'll be out there. Just kidding. So anyway,
water skiers, I guess.
Water skiers. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and we'll see y'all next week. All right. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Yeah.